Fun Ideas Productions presents the Fun Ideas Podcast.
Hi, this is Mark Arnold, and welcome to Fun Ideas Podcast number 34. If you would like to comment and or be a guest on this podcast, please drop me a line at funideas.mark@gmail.com. You can become a Patreon of Fun Ideas Productions, and if everyone listening just contributed $1 a month, that would be a tremendous help. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel. Alvin! The story of Ross Bagdasarian Sr., Liberty Records format films, and The Alvin Show is out. Order your hardback, paperback, and ebook copies today on Amazon or at bearmanormedia.com. Thank you for watching me on Stu's show last week, bringing in Stu Showstack's highest ratings to date. Our guest today is an artist who loves Underdog, and now he draws it for American Mythology's various Underdog comic book series. Here he is, Matt Hansel. So, on the phone today I have Matthew Hansel. How are you?
I am well. How are you?
Fine, good. So, I know you from being an Underdog artist, but I mean,
yes.
You may have other artistic inclinations, but let's start with this. How did you get started as an artist, and what type of training have you had in your lifetime?
I have always wanted to be a cartoonist. For at least as long as I could remember. I was always fascinated with drawing and, making pictures, telling stories with pictures and whatnot. And Underdog was just my favorite thing in the world as a kid growing up. I say my cartoon pedigree right now on Facebook or Twitter, there's a thing, your comic book DNA, that's going around. Mm-hmm. And it's like 4 issues that really influence you growing up as a kid or whatever. And I got me to thinking about my cartoon DNA, and a big part of my just comic book cartoon DNA is Underdog, the Ralph Bakshi Spider-Man, and the Adam West Batman. So that's influenced a lot of my views on things. I was always a compulsive doodler, like most cartoonists were. I just always drew. In school I would draw on the main part of the page and take notes in the margins instead of doing it the other way around, like most people. And I just was fascinated with it. Everyone I know growing up always told me you can't make a living being an artist, and that was beaten into my head so much so that I always thought, well, I'll end up doing it as a side thing or whatever. Mm-hmm. And to that end, my actual formal academic training is all in journalism and political science.
Oh, wow.
Because I was going to be a political cartoonist. Mm. And I figured if I was going to do that, I should really understand politics and government and all that kind of stuff. And when I was in college, of course, like a lot of people, I had my own cartoon strip. I had a daily comic strip, and I was also an editorial cartoonist, and just fell in love with it, but got sidetracked for 15 years after grad school, working in our local government. And if ever I needed something to convince me that I don't need to do an office job, and that I really loathe rules and regulations that seem random and arbitrary, be a high-level bureaucrat for 15 years, and that'll definitely teach you all that. But wow. my entire purpose in doing all of that stuff, I always kept my eye on the prize. Everything I did, I tried to push through that filter of doing comics. Mm-hmm. So journalism and political science are very writing intensive, and even though it's not fiction writing, writing is writing is writing. Can you get your point across? Are you telling an interesting story? Whatever. Right. And so I credit a lot of my being able to write and tell stories and things like that because of journalism, and I think that's a big part of being a cartoonist. And so I'm self-taught. I bought every single book I could find on cartooning and drawing, and one of the things going to college teaches you is how to academically approach a problem, right, and basically how to self-study. I really think a big part of academia is teaching you how to think and how to study and how to analyze. Yep. And so I figured if I could do that with politics, I can certainly do that with art. And so I approached with the same veracity that I did my academic studies, my kind of self-discipline in art, and taught myself a variety of styles and really broke down, people's approach to art and things like that. Really did deep dives on a couple different artists like Jim Aparo and Neil Adams and Jeff McNelly and Dick Loker. And put all of that together, and practice and draw incessantly, and here you are. Here I am.
Yeah. Now,
and that was really long and rambly. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. We got an hour.
We'll fix it.
We have an hour to kill. No, we have time to fill. Stretch. Say more. No. Anyway, so. If you're mentioning those guys like Neil Adams et al., do you draw in their styles as well, or does it still come out like Underdog?
No, I can. Actually, right now, Neil Adams has a Patreon that he does, where he doesn't show you how to draw like Neil Adams, but of course he's drawing like Neil Adams, so you kind of see how it happens.
Who does that?
But he really shows you how he approaches art, including how to trace photographs correctly, how to use photographs correctly.
Tracing?
All that kind of stuff.
Anyway.
Yeah, he you know what? When you see him do it, you're like, that's why his art looks the way it does.
Hey.
Because he shows you the camera's rolling. There's a 45-minute video of him doing it, showing you exactly how to take a Ted Danson picture and turn him into Batman.
Right.
And another one how to turn him into Bruce Wayne. I mean, it's fantastic. It really is.
Well, the reason why I asked you that is because, like, I can draw Underdog myself. I'm probably not as good as you, but I mean, it's like it's even harder for me, and I even had some formal art training. I did art instruction school, draw tippy, and all that stuff.
That's cool.
Yes, I did.
That's awesome.
Took me 4 years to do it, but I did do it. So
I have one of the correspondence books from one of the 50s courses that I bought off of eBay like a decade ago, and I basically went through and did all the lessons in it. So
even though I can draw more realistic, and I can't say I was ever like Neil Adams, it still kind of comes out more like Sergio Aragonés at the best.
I can do it. I'm actually working on some samples right now to give to American Mythology, because Underdog is quarterly, so I still have some holes in my schedule. So I really would like to do some of the Edgar Rice Burroughs stuff, and so I'm putting together some samples of the Carson Napier, the Venus stuff. And we'll see what they say about that. And then in a couple months I'm going to start doing some cards in a more realistic style for Upper Deck.
Well, I'm glad you have that versatility there, like I said. But then, in my line of whatever I do is like I realized I liked writing more than drawing, and so I just kind of moved away. And I did do a few comic books over the years, but drawing was always kind of a means to an end. It's like if I couldn't find somebody else to draw it, I'll do it myself, said the little red hen. But it's
sure, right.
But it's basically the kind of the Charles Schultz way of drawing characters. You put them two characters standing behind a wall, so you don't have to draw their bodies. It's the cheater way, and there's no backgrounds. So
sure.
it's like, so that's the way I draw. It's like, because I just want to get the idea across. I want to get the jokes across, and there's only any sort of background if it's needed for the joke, or whatever.
One of the things, I'm glad you say that, actually, because one of the things that really draws me, not only just to cartoon, to Bigfoot cartooning, but also to people that really know how to do Littlefoot cartooning well, is that what you're really doing in a cartoon, especially in a comic strip where you really don't have much space at all, but this is true even in comic books, I think, you're basically doing a stage play with minimal set design. So my approach to backgrounds and everything, you don't have to be George Perez every single time. And that's not an affront to George, because I love his stuff. But for most stories, you don't have to be hyper detailed like that. You need enough stuff so you can establish, we're in someone's kitchen, or we're in front of the Statue of Liberty, or we're in downtown Washington D.C. or wherever. And that's one of the things that really appeals to me about comics is that's part of the puzzle of figuring out the narrative is what elements can you really reduce something down to that you can show the minimal amount of things but still suggest a lot of other stuff and still get people's minds to think, oh, that's a Victorian mansion or whatever it is that you're whatever it is that you're drawing.
Right. Well, that's why I am a minimalist. There we go. Now that sounds official and sophisticated.
It's Alex Toth, said simplify, simplify, simplify. Eliminate everything you can, and then just draw the hell out of what's left. And that's one of the things that Alex is another one of the artists I've really studied. At looking not only at him, but then he was a big champion of Milton Caniff and Frank Robbins and Noel Sickles and all those guys. And so that caused me to become huge fans of Milton Caniff, and I'm a huge Jim Aparo fan, and Jim was a huge Milton Caniff was a huge influence on Jim. And so what's funny to me is to kind of construct the DNA of my heroes and see, Aparo draws Bruce Wayne in a certain way because that's exactly how Milton Caniff drew Steve Cannon. That kind of stuff is fascinating to me.
Now, have you ever found, a lot of people say Caniff was an inspiration. I could probably look it up, but do we know who Caniff's inspiration was? Was it somebody like, I don't know.
I should know this because I read R.C. Harvey's huge, encyclopedia-sized novel that he wrote about Caniff, and I can't remember who it is.
Okay.
It's one of them is the guy that painted the Uncle Sam poster,
James Montgomery Flagg, yeah.
Yes, James Montgomery Flagg. But he was a very popular influence of a lot of the artists of that era. But he was also pretty heavily influenced by Noel Sickles, who was a studio mate for a while. And a lot of Milt's shadow work, I think, comes directly from sharing a studio with Sickles. And they both also... I think it's called the Landrin School. I have the book somewhere, but in the 1920s there was like a male. We were talking about correspondence courses before. There were two different ones. Chester Gould did one of them, and Milton Caniff did the other one. And I think Landrin School of Cartooning is the one Milt did, and I can't remember what the other one was that Chester did. Chester Gould. But those had a pretty big influence. I got a recent reprinting of the Landrin School one a couple of years ago and took it with me when I was on vacation. It basically just said, well, I'm on vacation this week. I'm going to do every lesson in this book. And you can definitely see where cartoonists from the 20s and 30s like Chester Gould and Arnold Gray, or Harold Gray, rather, the Orphan Annie guy, where their influence comes from, because it came from this school that they all did. So it's kind of funny. They all really strove for the same uniform kind of cartoon style. Nowadays people complain when you draw like somebody else,
right?
And 80 years ago that was the goal, was to draw like somebody else, right?
Well, also, to draw more realistic. It's like we will delve into the more cartoony stuff, but it seemed like it took a while to get like newspaper strips to get really cartoony. There was a few along the way, but even then, things like Crazy Cat and Toonerville Trolley, let's say, that are more cartoony, still had pretty elaborate backgrounds, and
absolutely. If anything else, it was just the figures themselves were cartoony. Everything else was fairly hyper realistic. In a lot. I've recently been looking through the Floyd Gottmuller Mickey Mouse daily strip collections, and I've never seen them before, and I'm just blown away by the amount of detail he was able to put into those strips. It's amazing. But yeah, you're right. Cartoon strips, everyone there were a lot of parameters with which everyone seemed to operate.
Right. And then, once Peanuts took off in probably not immediately, but, once it took off, let's say in the 60s more than 1950, but, then everybody kind of more simplified. You talk about Mickey Mouse, even if it was the same guy still doing it, Floyd Gottfredson, it was very streamlined way of doing it. There's not these big adventures as gag a day, just simple cartoons. And And, the most elaborate one I can think of off the top of my head is like Nancy, going from Fritzy Ritz down to, the simplicity that Ernie Bushmiller put to things on later strips and things like that. But
yes, they really kind of just strip everything away. And what was funny was that not all the cartoon strips were doing that, because obviously, like High and Lois, even though it's a fairly cartoony style, Dick Brown really, especially on the Sunday pages, just went to town in terms of, a master class in how to do cartoon rendering of trees and bushes and, grass on a hill somewhere, things like that.
And of course, there's stuff that never simplified, like Prince Valiant, going from Hal Foster to John Colin Murphy or whatever. It's like, they kept the quality up there, but, I hate to say it, all you Prince Valiant fans, I always thought that was a boring strip. But anyway.
I did too. It's incredibly cool to look at.
Yes.
I've looked at many of them, but I have no idea what the story is, because I don't read them, because the art is so overwhelming that it kind of blows you away.
The best one, I think this is in Mad, and I think Wally Wood did it. It was just a 4-panel thing, and it said, "Our Story," and it shows a picture of, like, Prince Valiant kind of slumping down in a chair taking a nap, and they just drew the same picture 4 times in a row.
Yes, yes, and I think you're right. I think it was Wally Wood that did that. Yes, that is. Yes, that's exactly.
And I go, that's my opinion of a Prince Valiant right there, But anyway,
it's and this is probably a podcast for another time, but it's a shame what they've done to newspaper comic strips.
Yeah.
When I look at Jim Keefe, I'm friends with him on Facebook, and when he posts the Flash Gordon stuff, I'm like, Flash Gordon is a concept that even today should still be incredibly cool, and a lot of people should want to read it. But the space in which they've been forced to try to operate, it's like trying to put a full orchestra into the music shell at your local high school or something,
or a garage band or something.
Right? Yeah, exactly. It's not going to work.
And of course, everything, at least in a newspaper, is now postage stamp size frames, and it's like
exactly. It's crazy, because all that stuff I think really could just have such a fantastic life, especially even if they hired people today who, instead of taking a quote unquote new take on it, really just kind of did a kind of scrape some of the barnacles off and just kind of give it a new coat of paint and reintroduce it.
Right.
I think that would have a lot of credibility.
Now, you mentioned, you have comic art in the American Mythology books, but have you had anything in the newspapers over the years, or a strip? Or
I have not. Dick Loker, I was very good friends with him. He was the guy that drew Dick Tracy.
Right.
Right before Joe Stanton took over. And Dick had drawn the strip for, I can never remember if it's 25 or 30 years or something.
That's right. Yeah.
But he, when he was retiring, apparently had plans that me and a couple of other guys who were friends with Dick he was going to slowly kind of transition the strip to us. And we were going to do it, and I was going to pencil it, and Jim Brosman was going to ink it, and my buddy Jeff Kirsten was going to write it. But for whatever reason, the Chicago Tribune had no interest in doing that, and instead went with Mike Curtis and Joe.
Right.
So that's the closest I've come. I would give my left arm, because my right one is what I draw with, to work on one of the strips. And if if the newspaper gods came to me and said you could draw one strip for the rest of your life, it would be super hard for me to pick between one of the three, either Dick Tracy, Shoe, or Hagar the Horrible.
Oh, wow.
And three more different art styles I can't imagine.
Yeah, but even Shoe is more elaborate than Hagar usually is.
Right,
so
right. And McNally is just one of my absolute favorite artists.
Right.
So it would be. I offer to Gary Brookins once a year to help him out with Shoe if he needs it, or pluggers, and he always very politely turns me down.
Well, I know Mike and Joe are currently doing well with Dick Tracy. I did interview Mike Curtis on a podcast. It hasn't aired yet, but I mean it will by the time this one goes up. So check it out. We actually did an early Dick Tracy 90th anniversary show because it's going to be double duty because I'm writing an article for Hogan's Alley, so I needed to interview Mike anyway, so we did it that way.
Oh, cool. That's very cool.
And I've interviewed Joe before, but not in a while. It was mainly about Scooby-Doo when I did, so.
There you go.
So he's as versatile as you, so it's like,
Joe, actually, Joe, there's two artists who I don't ever hardly mention them, and I don't know why. But, when people ask you about your career, like, I was like, oh, you're going to be famous, you're going to do this. And my goal has never been to be like Jim Lee or Todd McFarlane or John Byrne or one of those guys. I've always thought if I could be like Rick Burchett or Tom Mandrake or Joe Staten and just be, and even Aparo to a large extent, they were the workhorses, right? They were the guys that did all the monthly work that no one else wanted to do. And they had careers and good careers and worked steadily. That's all I want.
Joe is great, and his career is great. I mean, he'll talk at length about E-Man or Scooby-Doo or Dick Tracy, and those are three distinct eras that are completely different.
Exactly. And Joe, Denny O'Neil kept Joe really busy in the 90s, which was kind of my golden age of comics.
Right.
And so Joe was drawing, 1 month he'd be doing, Batman Shadow of the Bat in his more realistic kind of, Guy Gardner style.
Right.
And then the next month he'd be doing the Batman Adventures annual with Terry Beatty and, the Bruce Timm style. And they were both fantastic.
Yes.
It was great. I really would, if his inker ever needs a break or whatever, I would love to just take a couple months and ink Joe on Dick Tracy. I think I would have a lot of fun with that.
Well, I know her. It's Shelley Plager. She actually lives here in Oregon. She's not too far.
Really?
I'll go knock on her door and say, hey, give Matt a chance.
You need a vacation.
Yes, exactly. She has a Facebook friend. Actually, she's a really good artist in her own right. She did the cover of my Best of Harveyville Fun Times. I don't know if you've seen that book.
Oh, yes. Oh, I didn't know that. She did the cover for it. Oh, that's really cool.
And she did a page in my Beatles book, which is a cute picture of the Beatles circa 69, and it's titled, I just looked at it today because I was showing someone in the book earlier today, Maxwell's Silver Hammer. And basically all the other Beatles are clobbered on the heads, and it shows Paul holding a hammer.
That's really cool.
So, yeah, she's good at caricatures and everything, but she just does the inking, but she loves it. She has a ball with it.
She do I think she does the lettering, too, doesn't she? Does someone else do the lettering?
Yeah, she does the lettering. Somebody else does the coloring.
I know it's like a 3 or 4 person operation.
I'd have to re-listen to the podcast of that person's name. I forgot. Sorry, but it's all about Dick Tracy. So if you're a fan, it was intentionally to be solely about Dick Tracy. So
cool.
Because go ahead.
I was going to say, if you're looking for someone else to talk about Dick Tracy too, the museum, the Chester Gould Dick Tracy Museum board president Jeff Kirsten. He knows the entire history of Dick Tracy, and he is, I'm going to say, going to be Chester Gould's official biographer someday.
Okay. Well, that might be good because, like I said, this article isn't just, it's about Dick Tracy, and I have a couple years to prepare it, so
cool.
I might do a podcast with him. So I have all these Dick Tracy podcasts, you can skip over.
Right, and Jeff could help you get insight into the strip because he writes the historical essays for all the IDW reprints.
Oh, I see, yeah.
For the strip, and so he's really delved into Chester's archive archives and also Colonel McCormick's archives, and he's discovered some interesting things about the strip. He'd probably be a pretty good interview.
Oh, okay. All right, very good. I'm always looking for new people to interview and stuff like that. And I don't mind talking about Dick Tracy. Admittedly, it's not my favorite strip, but I've always been intrigued by it. And, I've read a goodly amount of them, but usually it's like in those old compilations they used to have, Dick Tracy's greatest cases, those type of things.
Yep.
So, I haven't gone through the year-by-year books like they have now, but, it's...
One of my goals in life, especially since IDW is doing all kinds of team ups and they have the Dick Tracy license at the moment, would be to do a Golden Age Batman Dick Tracy team up. So draw like the Dick Spring kind of Batman with the kind of 50s Chester Gould Dick Tracy, and you could do a total out of continuity story, like team up the Joker and Flat Top or whatever, and have them go to town.
That was one thing Mike Curtis talked about. He has done some guest appearances, like he actually had the Spirit show up. So so he's doing things like that. He's very well versed about the history as well, but he has a diverse enough background, even more not worse, but even more diverse. I'll say that in a nice way than Joe Staten. He was a movie theater manager. He worked as a host, a ghost host or whatever, on a horror TV show.
He was a cop for a while.
Yeah.
I think.
So
he's also a fairly successful small press publisher.
Yeah, and that's where I met him. Well, also through Richie Rich. He was writing Richie Rich stories in the '80s, and so that's where I first met him.
I didn't. That I did not know.
Yes, he was one of the first writers that they hired when the original company, was reorganizing in the early 80s. And when he came back, he wrote some new stories. And then he continued on into the 90s, did some of those New Kids on the Block stories and things like that.
Wow.
And he didn't say this in the interview the other show, but he said that was so frustrating to do, writing about New Kids on the Block, until I decided I'm going to write stories about the monkeys. And then suddenly stories came springing to life.
They made perfect sense to me. Right?
So, you just have to change the character. So if you're like working on something, I don't like this character, but now it's Underdog. Okay, now I can
do that. Exactly. Well, I always treat Underdog in comic book form.
Yeah.
Basically as the Wayne boring Superman from the 50s. You guys, I'm sure you know, Joe Harris said part of Underdog's origin is kind of the George Reeves Superman, which is who basically the Wayne boring Superman is.
Yeah.
From the I Love Lucy episode.
Right. Yeah.
And that's part of the pedigree.
Right.
And so especially when I heard Joe say that, I was like, of course, that makes perfect sense, right?
Well, I interviewed all four guys. I'm sure you've read my book, right?
I have, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and unfortunately, they're all gone now. And in fact, I think everybody I interviewed for that book has now gone. I'm trying to think. Because Bradley Bulkey just passed away,
Yes.
and it's like, but all the four of them, I think Joe Harris was the last one. He died 2 years ago, and it's like, oh well, you gotta go sometimes. But I'm always happy when I did that book that they were all alive and aware and had great memories and were very talkative and everything. So
that's one of the reasons why I love that book, is because there's no loss of recollection or anything like that. They kind of tell the story exactly how it was.
I mean, it was Chet Stover told that story, and I put his version in about the I Love Lucy episode.
Oh, okay.
And I will say this. I won't name the name, but a very hardcore I Love Lucy fan. A very hardcore Superman fan quibbled about that episode and how his recollection was, and I go, this is this man's recollection. I'm not going to change his recollection, and we get the gist of it. It was Superman on Lucy, and he got the idea for Underdog. That was the gist of it. But he was going on about, it's like, well, that's not what happened in Superman. Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it's an Underdog book. It's not a Superman book, and it's the guy's recollection. I mean, I will change something if I'm interviewing somebody, and this actually happened in the book, is when I interviewed Bradley Bulkey, he kind of remembered that there were 70 2 episodes of Tennessee Tuxedo. Well, there weren't. There was actually 70, so I corrected it without telling him. You know, just did it because, you know, you don't remember how many you did. You know, you just kind of had 72 in the mind, so, you know.
And the thing is, people nowadays are more aware of keeping historical records and things like that.
Right.
For all those guys, it was a job.
Yeah. And for Chad, it wasn't like he was religiously watching Superman or I Love Lucy. I mean, the recollection was he was walking in the room, I think, if I remember correctly, and, you know, he just happened to see it on, and it was the episode that Superman was on. And he said, you know, because the whole deal was they gave this cryptic note is they needed a new character after Tennessee Tuxedo. And they said, stay away from certain characters, and they were kind of referring to frogs, you know, which Jay Ward was doing Hoppity Hooper, and that's what they were referring to. And they said, and try to make it something super, you know, and so that was kind of a hint already, you know, that, you know, we should probably do something with heroes or something.
With
you know?
heroes,
Yeah, and it kind of came out of that, and, you know, it's like, so I get the story, you know. Let's see, what I was going to ask you. I mean, you're a big fan, so how did you become a fan of Underdog? Was it the TV show or the comic books, or both?
It was a TV show. I grew up and still live in the Chicago area, and the first thing I remember seeing on television is whatever package they were running of Underdog, Tennessee Tuxedo, and King Leonardo.
Okay.
They basically would intermix all 3 shows in whatever syndication package that they had.
Right.
And I fell madly in love with Underdog, and that was right around the time I saw the Christopher Reeves Superman movie.
Oh, yeah.
And then also Channel 9 in Chicago, I think it was on Saturday mornings, used to run the George Reeves Superman show. So I was, you know, Superman was a pretty awesome thing to me. And then when I saw Underdog, that became my more favorite thing, because, of course, Underdog was cartoony and fun and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
And so I would watch it when I came home from kindergarten or in the afternoons or whenever it was on, and I loved it so much. It was fantastic. And of course, this was in the early '80s, like late '70s, early '80s. So there were no Underdog comic books. It was just the cartoon show. That was all that was out. And it was kind of a bonding thing for me and my dad, too, because he watched King Leonardo and Odie when he was a kid.
Yeah.
And so it was kind of cool to be able to do that stuff. I'd really like to, if American Mythology wanted to do it, I would love to do a King Leonardo, Odie, the Hunter, just like a big special of all of them together.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind writing for those either, but also I would love to have, and unfortunately Shout Factory didn't want to do this, I wanted to do a King Leonardo DVD set, and for some reason they balked at that idea. They said, nobody remembers that, and it's like, okay,
they do, because they used to in the syndicated packages, they would one of the ones with Tennessee Tuxedo had the King Leonardo stuff mixed into it. So I think the people that remember Underdog in Tennessee and all those guys would remember King Leonardo. I actually pitched twice, and they still won't bite on it. Teaming up Underdog and the Hunter with Riff Raff and the Fox. Riff Raff and the Fox steal the Statue of Liberty or the Constitution, either one. You know, some symbol of America, and it throws the country into chaos, and they all think it's great. And it's up to Underdog and the Hunter to kind of hunt them down and save the day.
That's interesting why they wouldn't accept that. I mean, it's like...
Well, my idea is that they all exist in the same universe, because, and I would argue, even though this is a big no-no, that the Jay Ward people do too, because they were all animated by the same people. But it was the same people drawing them all.
Right. But you know from my book though that Underdog was originally supposed to be a spin-off of the Hunter. It never happened. They did write a script for it apparently, but I've never seen it. Maybe it was just a story pitch. But I mean, once they created the idea of Underdog, they realized it could just stand on its own.
Could be its own thing, right?
Yeah, so they didn't bother to do that because Hunter wasn't that well known. So it's like they said, yeah, let's just do our own thing, which I think is the better way to go because, I don't know, Hunter's I like it, but it's kind of a one-dimensional character.
He is. And when I wanted to team up one of the King Leonardo people with Underdog, he was the one I went to because he seemed the blankest of the slates. And he's I think he's a really good shell of a concept that if you nudged him, because I think he's a pretty funny character by himself.
Yeah.
But because he's just kind of who he is, if you push him in just a little bit different direction, like if you really played up like the guy, if you played up Noir, like how Guy Noir from NPR, if you kind of push the Noir thing a little bit more, with his private eye thing, I think that would make him a little more.
Yeah. If they ever did a reboot of Hunter, they would have to do it that way. Because, I mean, the way it came out, it's basically, hey, we have access to Kenny Delmar. I mean, basically, they just wanted a voice that sounded like Kenny Delmar, but then they found the real guy. And so it's really just based on him, and it's like, that's not really a character. Even Senator Claghorn that he was doing wasn't really a character.
No, he's just a voice.
And Foghorn Leghorn wasn't really a character, but he became more of a character because they fleshed him out with other characters on Looney Tunes, but
because they had to, because he's a one-episode kind of guy otherwise.
Right. So, so I was never enamored with Hunter. I just kind of said, well, it's another cartoon. But, like you, I think it's a toss-up with me. It's either Tennessee Tuxedo or Underdog is my favorite total television character.
Tennessee is pretty fantastic.
And
that was part of my team up with the Hunter and Underdog in order to figure out part of the plot, and I hadn't figured out what the MacGuffin is yet. They have to go to Mr. Whoopi, who gets out the 3D BB, and I thought that would tie everything in together. It would be fantastic, right?
Well, it would be great to create like a whole if they were smart, but nobody seems to be smart that's in power of these things. I'll just put it out there to the universe and maybe this will happen. If NBC Universal, which owns DreamWorks Animation, which owns Classic Media, which owns the total television characters, were smart, they would do a non-CGI total television movie that would have all the characters interacting together with a great story that would be a 90-minute thing that would reintroduce all the characters that we all know and love together. But
and they could animate it super cheaply because Underdog and all the rest of them, 1960s animation is basically what we would consider nowadays animatics.
Yes.
And you could totally do Underdog looking exactly like he did. Actually, you could make him look a little sharper.
Yeah, you just do a flash animation type thing. Yeah, but not so bouncy head, but
No. But exactly. You could, I mean, it would be, oh my gosh, it'd be so easy to do.
But
and all they have to do is hire a couple of guys like us.
Yes, exactly. But you know how it'll come out, and we've seen the results of it, the live-action Underdog movie that we don't want to talk about. I won't, you can't say anything nice, but the thing that the Underdog movie gave me, which I can never take away from it, that's how I met Joe Harris. Oh, okay.
So I had read an interview with him. There was a box set or something maybe coming out right before the movie debuted or something, or maybe it was when they announced the movie, I forget. But a paper in Tennessee had interviewed Joe, and I had read it because I had a tickler for, Underdog on the news search. And I contacted the journalist that wrote the article and said, hey, would you mind giving me Joe Harris's email? I'm a big Underdog fan. I want to pitch a comic book. IDW Publishing's interested. It would be really cool if Joe got involved. And he gave me his email address. And Joe and I had a wonderful pen palship for a couple of years as a result of that.
Yeah. Great.
So I that's the only thing I will say nice about the Underdog movie.
Well, I mean, Joe didn't like it either. I mean, if you read my book, it was Buck Biggers constantly supported it, but then he was the one who kind of instigated it, and I think he got money from it. So he had a vested interest, whereas Joe, as usual, he was always kind of like the sad sack of the four.
He was
like he always acted like they didn't tell me we were stopping production. It just happened,
right.
Whereas
Right.
Buck said, "Oh yes, we had a meeting, they probably had a meeting and Joe wasn't there." It was probably just him and Chet.
I get the feeling sometimes that Joe, was just busy, had just nose to the drawing board all the time.
Yeah.
And lots of things happened around him that they assumed he was knowledgeable of that he wasn't.
So I always compare him to like the Beatles, as like Joe was like the Ringo, It's like
yes, he really was. It's absolutely. And it turns out that's even more true because he was the last one to to go, and I think Ringo's going to outlast McCartney.
Oh, probably.
So that analogy works much better.
Yes, but he was also the last to join, which I believe Joe was the last to join of the four, of the four owners.
Right.
So
yes.
it's like.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
Now, for my background, I'll just say this because some things I didn't put in the book. I don't know if I did or not, but my exposure to Underdog was it was still on Saturday mornings because it was the early 70s, and it was on syndicated in the weekdays in the 70s. And then they had the comic book, and it was I had the Charlton one, the first issue, and then there's some Gold Key ones later, and I preferred the Charlton ones because they actually adapted the stories that they did on the TV show, and I didn't understand why the Gold Key ones couldn't do that, as a kid.
And the art on the Charlton ones is 1,000 times better. No disrespect to the Western guys, but because. As I recently found out, Frank Johnson, who was one of Mort Walker's assistants, he and Chris Brown and actually Greg Walker, Mort's kid, all worked on the book.
Yeah.
So you had Mort Walker type cartoonists doing that, and I really love the stuff. My own cartoon approach to Underdog is somewhere between the actual show and kind of Frank's version of it.
Well, I think Frank got it down best. It's really weird.
I do too.
And I'm so glad Charlton did it right for once. I mean, the paper's dreadful, but they could have given it to Ray Durgo, who did a lot of the Hanna-Barbera stuff. It was like,
Yes.
And
Frank, finding out that Frank had done Underdog and that he was connected to Mort Walker, which then meant Boner's art, and all that stuff. Yeah. I started looking into other comics he did, and he did Little Rascal and Little Rascal Twins or something. He did a bunch of like Dennis the Menace style comics for Charlton and a couple other publishers, and he's one of those cartoonists that I really admire because he pencil inked and lettered his own stuff. And he is just a wonderful cartoonist. That's another one of those things Underdog has given me is kind of the discovery of those cartoonists. And so the Gold Key series never excited me. I mean, I have them now, but when I saw them as a kid, I never collected them. And I kind of went in and out of liking those cartoons. And then somewhere along the line in the 80s, I got really interested in Jay Ward because I saw Rocky and Bullwinkle again. And I got it because by that time I was like 15 years old. And so I got the jokes, and I also realized something which I never thought before. The Rocky and Bullwinkle shows actually did tell complete stories. I didn't realize that as a kid because I wouldn't necessarily watch them every week or in order or anything, and so it would always be something happen, and then say, join us next time for this or this, and it's like then the next time I watch it'd be a totally different story, and it's like, did they ever finish whatever they were doing? It's a show with a ton of setups and zero payoff.
And I thought that's the way it worked, and so I didn't like Rocky and Bullwinkle, and I realized, oh, that's why, and like. Well, and imagine. Even Underdog was 4 parts, and sometimes you'd see the first 2, or you'd see the last 2, and I'd get pissed because I didn't think the other 2 were made, or something like that. So.
Well, and back then, of course, if you didn't catch it when it was on TV, when I was a kid, not everyone had VCRs or things like that.
No.
So it's not like you were taping this. It was like, I'm going to watch it, and if you missed it one day, you were mad because, like you say, you missed a part of the show, and now you'll never know what happened.
Right. Until it cycles around. around, and then by that time you forgot about it. But
Exactly.
Oh, the suffering we had to do, and now I can just walk over there and watch all of them on DVD. But oh well.
Exactly.
But I love that, and I'm so glad that Shout Factory did those when I did it, and I did get to interview Bradley and Buck Biggers one more time before they passed. Yeah, for
DVD.
those. Yeah.
No, I think they did such a great job with those in the Tennessee Tuxedo ones, and all of them that they worked on.
Now that was a bit of a struggle to make, and I didn't talk about this in the book because those were done years later. Classic Media still owned them at the time. They hadn't been bought out, but Classic Media didn't have all the episodes. And it's
really?
like they wanted to put out the complete, and they were like this close, this is fingers touching, this close to just saying, sorry, these episodes don't exist, it's not complete. And I said, we got to find them somewhere. I mean, they've aired endlessly the last 30, 40 years, somewhere. Right. Well, it turned out, then they discovered they had them, and this is what had happened. It's really bizarre. Buck and all those guys sold the characters to, I forgot the order. I think they sold it to Lorne Michaels of Broadway Video first, and then he sold it to Golden Books, and then that got sold. So it's been sold 3 or 4 times.
Right.
Somewhere along the line, they got messed up the copies of all the cartoons. They were no longer on film. They were on probably a video cassette or something. But somehow the audio got wiped somewhere.
Oh, no.
Yeah, for like half the cartoons. And so I said to the guys at Shout Factory, I have all the audio. If you have the video, can you match it up? And they go, sure. And so I shipped off all the bootlegs I had, and so all the audio is from my bootlegs, and the videos what they had.
Awesome! I did not know that. That is, or if I did know that, I forgot.
It wasn't really publicized anywhere. I mean, this is 8 years later, so I can say it. But I mean,
yeah, that's really cool. Thank goodness, for guys like you that have that.
So
that is...
when the Amazon reviews were saying, "Oh, this sucks. I hate this," and it's like you don't know how much effort it took to get it out the way it did. And it's
it almost didn't happen, right?
Some of the bumpers we couldn't find, and so you see them, and they're kind of in grainy condition because those are bootlegs too. But at least they agreed to put them on there. And I think the only thing that they missed, I think it's on the Underdog collection, it might be the Tennessee Tuxedo, is that they didn't get a couple of the King Leonardos, so they had to say, sorry, this is missing. And they really didn't have either the audio or the video, which is which is part of the reason why they didn't do a King Leonardo set. But I bet they exist if you went the bootleg market, but but they didn't want to do a King Leonardo set. I didn't push the issue after asking a few hundred times. So so there we are. So we got those two, and I'm happy for them. There's a few hiccups on them. I wish they put them on a Blu-ray and redo them and blah. But that's a whole other thing.
I really wish they would put them out on Blu-ray. That would be.
But it's kind of weird on cartoons in general. I mean, I don't know if you hear Jerry Beck on different podcasts and stuff like that. It's like, the days of DVDs and Blu-ray have passed. Everything's streaming. These studios, they don't care, and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, it's kind of frustrating for us collectors. So.
Well, and I know that a lot of times it seems the licensors aren't really aware of the potential. Yeah. In dealing, I've had other dealings with Classic Media because in my capacity being on the Chester Gould Tracy Museum board, the Tribune farms, or at least used to, farm out all their licensing to Classic Media. And so anytime we had to do something with Dick Tracy, the Tribune would just tell us to go work with the Classic Media people. And so many times we would pitch things that we would.
I didn't know that's what you were going to say. I was going to say, go fly a kite. I'll say it politely.
And then, the Classic Media people, we would tell them, we have a market for this. If you do this, and the Tribune markets it just a little bit, you have you'll make money. This is a thing that we can do, and they just they're not interested. Yeah. Oh, it's so frustrating.
It is weird though, because
I pitched to them and the Tribune, and I offered to do it for free for a year. Yeah. When CSI and all the cop shows were kind of at the height of their popularity, I said, why is there not an online interactive Dick Tracy Dick Tracy's the original police procedure.
Right.
Why don't we have this? And so I submitted a proposal to the Tribune and said, we're going to do an online Dick Tracy comic strip. Here's how all you guys have to do is set up a WordPress site, do this. I will do all the writing and the art for free because we need to tie in with CSI and all that kind of stuff. And they were not interested at all. They couldn't be more disinterested. It was so frustrating.
Well, I will say this on that podcast with Mike Curtis. I asked him about the infamous Warren Beatty Dick Tracy film. It was the one question that he basically said no comment. And so, but there's something to that film that has basically destroyed any spin-off other than the comic strip of Dick Tracy at this point.
Because there's I can't say a whole lot.
Yeah.
I don't think.
Yeah.
But the contract that the Tribune obviously had lawyers that had never dealt with licensing before, or at least were asleep at the wheel, or Warren Beatty at Disney really were much better at hustling than the Tribune was. And I was told at one point that the Tribune almost accidentally gave Beatty not just like the movie rights, but the rights to Dick Tracy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So I can see why he didn't want to talk about it because, we don't have to go any further either, but,
that's just a rumor.
Yeah. And like I said, I don't know if that's correct or not, but, it's like, it is kind of a shame, but, going back to Underdog, it's like, it's almost the same thing in a certain weird respect. It's like.
It is, absolutely.
So NBC Universal owns all this stuff that Classic Media collected over the years. And when Classic Media had it, they did okay with it, but they were already doing this bit where they were kind of getting really heavy on just promoting Rudolph every Christmas.
Yes.
Yeah. And now
you guys have like 1,500 licenses, and that's really the only one you know how to do.
And when they did that, at least they put out a few Harvey things, and they put out a few Jay Ward and Total Television things. But now there's like nothing, and it's like that's what I don't get. It's like
I just think they're missing opportunities because Netflix and everything else, clearly there's a market. I mean, the Sherman and Peabody Netflix show, it's not everyone's cup of tea. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
But it's, you know what, I know a lot of kids, because I go to a lot of comic book conventions, and I colored a couple Sherman and Peabody stories, so I have the comics there.
Yeah.
Kids run up to the table and love it because they've seen Sherman and Peabody in the movies or on Netflix or whatever, and they want to read more. They want to do this, but the licensors are not interested.
Yeah, because I mean, even when I consider, in the 70s that basically Underdog and all those characters were dormant. Yes, they appeared on Saturday morning. Yes, they appeared in syndication, but they're all repeats. That was when they had the most comic books out. That's when they had the most merchandise out. And it's like, there's nothing new being produced. Why can't they have that same mentality now? You just throw the old cartoons back on Nickelodeon or whatever channel, and start marketing toys. I did see a Rocky and Bullwinkle pop clips. I can't stand those things because I hate the zombie eyes on them. But, it's like, and I don't like the square heads. But at least there's a Rocky and Bullwinkle and Boris and Natasha and Sherman and Peabody. So they do have those. But no Underdog, no Mr. Whoopi, no Tennessee, it's like.
And I buy every, and like you say, in recent years it's been thin, but I buy every single Underdog thing they put out.
Yeah.
Not because I think they're all great, but because there's just nothing.
Right.
There is, nothing that they put out. I was, the Toy Fair was this weekend in New York, and I was looking to see if there was going to be any Underdog stuff, but nothing.
No. And I don't know what the deal is, and it's like, if NBC Universal likes to promote anything, it's always going to be like Madagascar or the Penguins or How to Train Your Dragon or whatever's current, and it's like, well, why not put it out, all of it? It's like, I don't know, if I was sitting on all these characters,
money on it all.
Yes, I don't understand licensors or anything like that. They just want those characters to die or something.
Well, it's kind of funny because on the one hand, it seems to me that people that are in charge of all the pop culture can figure it out on the one hand that having to do shows with mass appeal isn't really a requirement anymore, right? Because if you have a small, fervent enough fan base, you can do fine.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Marvel and DC could do the same thing. There's a market out there for 1980s style Batman and Superman and X-Men stories, right?
Right.
So why doesn't Marvel just say, you know what? Screw continuity, whatever. We're just going to do X-Men 80s or whatever.
Yeah.
And that way, all the people that think that those kind of stories done with that kind of art style, with that kind of perspective, whatever, go do it. Because if you have 10,000 people that are enough to really support a book like that, that's enough to make it go, right? That's enough to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And they could do the same thing like with Underdog, whatever. The audience probably isn't huge, but you could start small, and who knows, it might take off. Retro things come back all the time.
Yeah. And, I've even thought this, and Marvel, since you mentioned that, but it applies to Underdog too, is like, if everybody supposedly loves the Marvel age in the 60s, that's what I'm going to go by. Why not just start reprinting the comics in order, just on cheap paper, just monthly. I mean, they could charge $4 for it like they do now, but, and they have done that in recent times because I've seen them, but they just jump around. They don't do them in order. And it's like when we were kids, they used to have Marvel Tales, which was reprints of Spider-Man. That's how I read all my Spider-Man. I didn't read the originals.
John Byrne told me one time that when he was doing Fantastic Four and Alpha Flight, they were doing classic X-Men reprints, right?
Yeah.
And the only new thing about the classic X-Men reprints were he was doing new covers for them.
Yeah.
He told me his royalties on that reprint series were almost as much as his royalties on the Fantastic Four. For a book that Marvel had produced 10 or probably 15 years at that point previous, and they were making money hand over fist. Marvel and DC used to realize that they could, put one new story on an 80-page reprint and sell it for $2, and lo and behold, you make money.
Yeah.
I really think that's DC's mindset with the Walmart books that they're doing and stuff.
Yeah.
I've read that they're doing really well because they've expanded the line to 6 books now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically what they are. There's a new, I think it's a 10 or a 12-page story or something like that.
Yeah, I've gotten a few.
And then the rest are reprints. And you know what? If that gets, seats people reading comics, that's...
Although, I wish they'd have reprints that went further back, but that's just me.
Oh, I do too.
It's like, hey, here's an ancient oldie but goodie from 2009. I'm like, yawn, snore.
Right, exactly. I'm like, White Boy, I thought we were going to show them, the classic stuff like Neil Adams and Dick Sprang. And, show them the actual evolution of Batman.
Yeah.
And you don't have to show them the crazy Mort Weisinger stuff, right? You show them the good stuff, the Bill Finger stuff. But...
And so I was thinking we should reprint all the Underdog. Now, I will give American Mythology kudos that they do kind of half new and half reprints. So, and they do consult me, even though they don't always give me credit, but they have in the past. So I'm giving myself.
I did not know that. That's very cool.
They consult me and they go, "Who drew this one? Who wrote this one?" And so anytime they have any credits, it's usually from me because I've given it to them. Yeah.
That's really cool.
And they've given me credit for credits, but they don't do it every issue. So it's like, thanks, James. But anyway, I'll give you credit. Anyway.
Speaking of the Underdog comic book, the new Underdog and Pals that's coming out, hopefully soon, has a couple of firsts in it. Mm-hmm. It's the first multi-part Underdog story done over multi-issues instead of, a multi-part story in one book.
Yeah.
So it's a 3-issue story. It team-ups all the villains, or almost all the villains, and it has the first double-page spread in an Underdog comic book.
Oh, wow.
Which was a lot of fun. When I drew it, when I read the script, I'm like, oh my God, this is a double-page spread. And I emailed Mike Wolf, for my editor. I'm like, this is the first time there's been a double-page spread in Underdog. This is so cool. Mm-hmm. And so I'm kind of it's kind of surreal to me that the Underdog that I'm going to draw is going to be part of the canon. That's kind of heady.
Do you know how many stories you've done so far at this point? I mean, I get all the books, but I can't keep track of who draws what.
I have done 1, 2, I've done 3 published Underdog stories. I have 2 that are so far unpublished at the moment.
Okay.
And then there are 2 Commander McBragg stories that I've done that are not yet published. And I think, because I keep begging for one, that at some point when I finish Underdog number 2, there's a Tennessee Tuxedo script out there for me somewhere. Because I've been asking about doing that, about doing a Tennessee story, mostly because I got to ink a cover that Bill Gavin did with Tennessee and Chumley on it, but I really want to draw Mr. Whoopi in the 3D blackboard.
Right.
That's a pretty big goal of mine.
Right.
And I don't know why, but Mr. Whoopi is one of my favorite.
I would love to write for all of them. I mean, I did get a couple published. One was an Ant and the Aardvark, and one was the Three Stooges, but. They're pretty tough over there, at least for writers. I don't know about artists. Do they accept your stuff pretty readily, or no?
It depends. When the publishing schedule is a little wonky sometimes.
Yeah.
On the last 2 issues of the old Underdog series that I inked and colored, we were under the gun both times, and so I did all of the art corrections that DreamWorks wanted. And on both those issues, and this is not a reflection on Bill at all, because he is a brilliant cartoonist, but DreamWorks has a very haphazard approach, it seems, sometimes to the art corrections they want to do. Yeah. Some of them I totally understand, because they want it really on model, and that's fine. But they randomly pick characters in the background sometimes to change, and for no reason, because they only slightly alter what they want. But they're pretty specific. Me and one of the other artists have a kind of a fun contest going to see who can get a job through with the least amount of corrections. Yeah. And I'm still waiting on 3 other jobs that I think shouldn't have too many in them. Yeah. But Jeff so far I think has the least amount of corrections. I think he turned in an 8-page job and only had like 2 or 3 things to fix.
Right. Because on my own experience in writing, it's like, I probably turned in about 3 dozen pitches, but only about a third of those made it to script, and then only 2 have been published. So it's like I'm kind of been lackadaisical in recent times. It's like, because I've been doing like this, the podcast and other projects, but I go, I don't know how to get published here. It's like, because they don't tell me that the other ones are rejected, they just don't talk about them. It's like, I go, what about these other 30 stories I turned in? And it's like, well,
it's working. There's the communication is strange with DreamWorks in terms of how things go. Yeah. And it's like, one time we turned in a story, and I swear to God, in 2 weeks we had all the corrections and everything back, and it was all good to go. Yeah. And then on Underdog and Pals 1, I think we turned in the stuff in July or August, and we just finally got the pencils back in December. It's. But DreamWorks, I guess, has told us they're going to do better about turning around, because it would be cool if we could get Underdog, going monthly or every other month or something like that.
Well, we talked about teaming up at some point, but I suppose I could create some more pitches and stuff like that. Go ahead. What did you say? I'm sorry.
I would like to do that, because what I think we should do is create the pitch, and I'll put together a splash page, a cover, or like a little 2-page sequence from it or something. Yeah. And maybe that'll whet their appetite.
Yeah, because it's like, sometimes I go, maybe because I'm just writing it, they don't get it, what I'm trying to get across. Meanwhile, in my mind, I visualized it. I know exactly, and this would be a great story, but so it just kind of falls flat. And I hate writing pitches. I can't stand it. I just like writing the story. I have the idea in my head, and it's like the way I kind of write, which is, I don't know if it's unique, but it's different than I know other people write, is I just kind of do the stream of consciousness writing, and I finally get to the end result, and I do something that Harvey Kurtzman said that he did once when he used to do the Mad parodies, way back when he did the comic books. He said, and so I kind of emulate this. It's like he'd figure out what he'd want to do, like King Kong, let's say, and he would figure out like the punchline for the whole thing. Okay. And then he would start writing from the beginning, And so he already had the ending in mind, so he knew where he was going to go. But in the middle, he could go anywhere because he already knew how it was going to end. And I go, that's a great way to write, because, and so I try to write that way. And so I have an ending in mind, but I don't know how it's going to go. And sometimes when I write a pitch, and then it becomes a comic book story, it goes a totally different way than I originally planned, because I go, wow, this is funnier, this works better.
That's kind. My approach is somewhat similar, a little bit sideways. John Byrne is a pretty big influence of mine. Maybe not in terms of actual art style, but in terms of career and approach to the job and professionalism and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But he told me, and this is pretty much how I do it. He just writes a first draft. He just stream of content, like you say, just write everything down, and then he goes, then I just let it sit for a day, and then I go back and over the course of a couple days or a week, turn it into English, put it into something. And furthermore, he told me, and if I ever get to write Underdog and draw it, this is kind of how I want to do it. Mm-hmm. He would just come up with a plot, and then the cover for that issue was his plot. So it was kind of like Julius Schwartz in that way. Yeah. So he would go to his editor and say, this scene happens in the book, and here's the plot. And then he said, I very loosely, for the first 12 pages, just kind of every day as I'm doing my 3 pages, I just plot day by day by day. Mm-hmm. Then when I get to page 12, since I know how the issue is going to end, then I start plotting more tightly, and then get to the end, and that's when you do your subplots and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And that in my self-published stuff and things that I've done has served me pretty well doing it that way. Because I find I don't have the patience to sit down and type out a whole script. Yeah. A lot of times I will just thumbnail and script at the same time. Just because I can kind of do it sideways Marvel style that way. Mm-hmm. I can plot out what I want, draw it, kind of choreographic, and then do the dialogue, make sure it fits, and then move on to the next page. And, things like that.
Now, you mentioned you self-published stuff. What stuff have you done?
I did for about 2 years at Go Comics at their Comic Sherpa site. Mm-hmm. I did my own comic strip called Marty and Spud. Oh, okay. And Marty and Spud is, everyone says that it's Calvin and Hobbes, and it does owe quite a bit to Calvin. But it's really Dickie Dare, which was the first comic strip that Milton Caniff worked on. And the concept of Dickie Dare was that Dickie and his little dog would be, reading Robinson Crusoe or something and fall asleep, and then wake up in the novel, and then they get to have adventures with Robinson Crusoe and things like that. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, as a child of the 80s, that's what we used to play when we went outside, right? We'd play Star Wars or G.I. Joe or whatever. And so I thought, what if I did a strip where, without having to say it's Star Wars or whatever, I have this little guy and his cat, and they just make believe, and you're never quite sure if it's real or not. Adventures, that are influenced by Indiana Jones and, stuff like that. And so I did an Indiana Jones parody. I did a Star Trek one. I did a James Bond one. I did a Dick Tracy one. And it was a lot of fun. And a daily deadline really consumes your life. Yeah. It's pretty amazing. And I had a full-time job and was teaching also part-time when I was doing this, so I was really killing myself.
I think I did a webcomic for about 2 years. I don't even know if it's still up online anymore. I didn't even think about it.
Most of Marty and Spud is not online. And I like the concept a lot, but I'm very particular about what I want to do with it. Yeah. And so my original art approach to it was Bill Watterson penciling and Jeff McNally inking. That was kind of how I wanted it to look in my head. Mm-hmm. But I've really fallen in love since with Frank Johnson's artwork and also Hank Ketchum's artwork on Dennis the Menace, who is also another big influence on Marty and Spud. Mm-hmm. So I think I would like to do Marty and Spud graphic novels, which I think I could highlight, a theme better, like if I do a Star Wars parody or if I do a Justice League or whatever. Yeah. And do it more with that kind of a slicker kind of art approach to it. Yeah. Because Hank, I've become friends with now I can't remember his name.
Well, Ron Ferdinand?
Ron Ferdinand,
okay,
thank you.
okay.
Ron, I'm so sorry. I forgot your name. But I've become friends kind of with Ron on Facebook, and he posts, Hank Ketchum stuff. And
right.
he kind of had a relationship with a major cartoonist that I've always wanted. He was kind of like an apprentice to that. And his own cartooning is fantastic. His coloring on the Sunday pages is just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
I love it. But I'd really like to do something in that kind of vein.
Right.
I wouldn't mind working on Dennis, actually.
Well, you knew I did the Dennis book too, right?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I have read so much of your stuff because you seem to hop to everything that I am interested in. Between you and Rick Goldsmith, you guys have covered almost every part of my childhood.
Well, it's like if Rick didn't do the Rankin Bass stuff, I would have done it. It's like
I have to talk to Rick because I really want him and I to team up.
Yeah.
Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer is my absolute favorite Christmas thing ever. I mean, I was terrified of Santa Claus as a kid, but Rudolph was fine.
Right.
So that tells you a lot about the influence of cartoons, and the talking reindeer didn't scare me, but a man did.
Yeah.
But I want to do a graphic novel version of Rudolph because I don't think they've done a full-blown comic book adaptation of it.
They've done children's books. They've done
Yeah.
children's books. I don't think they have done a comic book yet. Yeah.
and I think that would be it'd be really cool to do.
Or at least of the Rankin. Or I'll amend that of the Rankin Bass version. I mean, yes, there are Rudolph comic books.
Right,
yes.
Yeah. No. I should have clarified. I mean the Rankin.
Yeah, because
Bass
DC did them for years.
Oh,
but,
absolutely.
But they have that Gopher character and the silly elves and stuff.
Exactly. But yeah, the Rankin Bass one, I really, I think I could really draw that well, and I think it would be fun to work on that.
Yeah.
I don't know if Rick's ever written comic books, so maybe you and I will have to do that instead. But that's on my bucket list, is to draw Rudolph in some official capacity at some point.
I should interview him at some point, but I just haven't got to. It's like, but anyway, I like all that stuff, and part of me is like jealous, like, oh, he did the Rankin Bass thing, but it was like I said, the reason why you've seen probably some of my books is because it's like I pick topics. I go, hey, there isn't a really good Dennis the Menace book that talks about the history. I mean, there's ones that Hank did himself, but they're all kind of self-promoting, saying, hey, aren't I great? It's like, yeah, you had a staff of about 20 people, but yeah, you were great, and it's like, that's what I wanted to know about. I wanted to know about all the other people that worked on these things, it's like.
Well, and we live in a society now where it's not a mark against any cartoonist that you have a field of assistants that are helping you.
No.
Because as much as a lot of people like to complain about corporate America and all that kind of stuff, these licenses are the way these guys make money. That's how they how they can afford to be an artist. So whatever they need to do to get the job done, more power to them. Garfield has created a whole industry in Indiana, and so many brilliant cartoonists have come out of Jim Davis's studio.
Right.
That you can't really look down on that. I mean, it's wonderful that Schultz did Peanuts solo.
Yeah. Which turned out to be an anomaly because it's like Ketchum liked to give the impression, and that was the nature of the way Walt Disney did it too. It's like I did everything, and it's like you find out, well, if you did everything, how come the comic books look different than the Sunday strip? Which looks different than your panel. Okay.
And the same thing with Chester Gould. Chet literally penciled Dick Tracy and inked the figures, but someone else, his brother, was doing the lettering. Someone else did the coloring. Someone, he had a police guy on staff that did all the police research. It wasn't a one-man operation by any stretch.
Right.
And there's no shame in that, I don't think.
I don't think so either, but it's like everybody's programmed to believe that one guy does it all just because of the fame of Charles Schultz, and he would constantly say that I've done all these strips by myself, and it's like you go, well, that's the way you do it, and then you find out, that they had assistants way back in the 20s and teens way back when, 100 years ago. So it's like, it's just Schultz was a weird guy. He wanted to micromanage his own strip, which is more power to him, but it's like, you know, I think I would have gotten assistance too later on.
Right. You know? It's a feat of superhuman strength. And the guys that did do it solo eventually do bring out. I mean, McNally did Shoe by himself for many years.
Yeah.
But then, you know, the at year 20, doing a daily deadline starts taking its toll.
Yeah.
You know, and it, you know, and Jeff said, you know, when he brought on Chris Cassett and those guys, that it reinvigorated his love for the strip because he could focus only on the drawing, which was the only part he really liked.
Yeah.
You know, and that someone else could help him with the gags and do all the, you know, putting it into a daily format, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And you can tell in the strip, in the reprint collections too, in the mid '90s when he brings other people on.
Yeah.
I mean, the strip was never bad, but it goes to the next level as a result of that.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the alternative would be, and you know, Schultz always kind of poo-pooed this too, and it's like, hey, you know, not everybody can do what you do, but you know, he kind of poo-pooed both Watterson or Calvin Hobbes and Gary Larson for Far Side because they stopped after 10 years. It's like,
oh right, yeah.
You know, it's like, well, there's no requirement you have to do these strips for 50 years yourself. You know,
right. You know, if I were Bill Watterson and I kind of said what I wanted to do, and the choice was I can burn myself out or I can live a pretty comfortable life and paint.
Yeah.
I think I'm going to go enjoy myself.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, you know, 10 years is a good run, you know, and it's like, man, you still see the collections in bookstores, so you did something right. So it's like,
right,
yeah.
Well, and it's kind of like, you know, British television has figured out that you don't have to have a series that just goes on and on and on and on.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with telling a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Right.
And just do it. You know, 6 good seasons is better than 25 mediocre ones, right?
Although they were guilty with Last of the Summer Wine, if you're familiar with that one. It went on for 30-something years, but anyway.
There's exceptions to every rule.
Yes. But yeah, I agree. It's kind of funny on a British series. It could go on for 10 years, and yes, we got 70 episodes, and it's like, wow, you do 70 episodes in one season here, you know?
Right, exactly.
But now we've kind of adapted the new way. It's like you get like these newer series like Stranger Things, and it's like, hey, 5 episodes, and it's like, that's it? It's like, you know, whatever. You know?
Exactly. But we've become trained to.
And then we'll do our season 2 now, 3 years from now. It's
right,
like,
right,
you know.
Right. You know, and The Sopranos trained us for that, right?
Yeah.
There's 3 years in between seasons.
So I guess the upshot of all of it is, you know, the rules can be broken now, you know, which, you know, it seems like comic strips as an entity, just you see them in the newspaper, is like basically gone. I mean, I did interview Joe Waz, and he does Maze Tunes, and he says, yeah, most of his money is made out of the online stuff, not being in newspapers. And the days of being in 2,000 newspapers, that's imaginary now. You can't even do it. There's not that many newspapers. So, you know, it seems like the only way you can make any money out of it, if there is a way, is to do a graphic novel like you're suggesting, or a compilation of stuff you've already published, you know, so.
I for a lot of this stuff, like I've often thought, and of course, it's money, right, is usually the main problem. But I think a lot of these comics, in order to really kind of drum up support for them or whatever, if you have the time and if the people working on them can do it, I think, like for Underdog, I would love it if we could, but it would cost too much money. Prior to the release of the books, we should be doing web strips, kind of whetting people's appetite and then keeping them interested in between issues. Even if you did just a weekly thing or something like that. And if there was if you could partner up with Webtoons or one of the big apps where you could get a kind of instant audience or instant eyes on it at least. Yeah. That there's a real opportunity between doing that, Patreon, and Kickstarter or Indiegogo or whatever it is, to make money. But you've got to be able. You can't. It's not all going to come from one source. It's like Joe says. You're going to diversify a lot to do it. And I think a lot of these properties could have a decent online experience, and that the cartoonists, the creative teams, could make a living doing them if the licensors were interested in doing it. Yeah.
But who knows?
But I mean, on the one hand, I think webcomics are incredibly cool, and in a lot of ways, I think we should be living in a golden age of cartoons, and in some ways we do. But I don't know. I would like to see some of the old properties still have more of a life.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially when only 3 companies own everything, it seems like.
Right. Right. It's Disney, Warner Brothers, and MGM, probably.
Well, the NBC Universal DreamWorks, that's what I call it now. I don't even know what to call it, but,
Yeah, I'm not sure. I just call them DreamWorks, but you're right. It's NBC Universal something.
And Archie, that's the 4th. It's like, that's about the only independent thing left, It's like...
There's another series I want to work on. I want to do Archie comics at some point, too. Mm-hmm. I think that would be a lot of fun. By total accident, one of the first comic books I ever read was Cheryl Blossom's first appearance. And she only, I think, appeared in maybe 2 or 3 stories and then kind of disappeared for a decade.
Right.
And I had those comics because the first couple comics I got were that Betty and Veronica issue, which I want to say is issue 320 maybe, and then a Batman versus Catman book, which had a wonderful Ed Hannigan DiGiordano cover on it. Mm-hmm. And I still have both of those. And so when Cheryl Blossom came back, when Dan Parent and Dan DiCarlo kind of brought her back in I think it was the early 90s, for the Love Triangle crossover, I picked it up, and I've picked up every Cheryl Blossom appearance since. So when I work at Archie, I have to do a Cheryl Blossom story. and 2 of my favorite cartoonists, Dan Parent and Holly Golightly, both have worked on Cheryl. So I have a bunch of stuff from Dan. I probably have a dozen pieces of original art. I need to talk to Holly about getting a Cheryl Blossom piece.
Yeah. I need to talk to Dan again. He's a good guy. I met him a few times. So.
I love Dan. He when I was trying to work on my inking, he sent me like a whole box full of Archie Xeroxes to practice my inking on, and has given me all kinds of pointers and has been very, very helpful. He's an awesome dude. Well,
let's see. Where are we here? We talked about a lot of stuff. Is there anything else you want?
I ramble. I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine. It was like, well, we were going to just talk about Underdog, which we did. So it's like, I guess now it's that time of the show where we just kind of do the plugs.
Yes, we've got Underdog and Pals 1 coming out hopefully soon. Issue 1, I believe, or at least my part of issue 1 is totally done. And so I believe it's all at DreamWorks now for its final kind of check over. And then once I get those corrections, if there are any, it's usually pretty quick after that. So I'm hoping maybe in a month or 2 we should have Underdog. But that's Underdog and Pals number 1. There's, I think, 3 different covers plus a sketch cover. So make sure you get the sketch covers so when you see me at a convention, I will draw Underdog on it for you.
Okay. And what convention appearances are you going to have this coming year?
I am doing next week, so on a podcast, this will have happened in the past, but I'll still plug it anyway. The first convention I usually do every year is the Northwest Indiana Con in Cherryville, Indiana. Okay. And it started off as a smaller regional show, but it's really grown pretty big. A lot of the Chicago cartoonists come down for it. Okay. And it's right in the middle of Northwest Indiana, which a lot of people associate with Gary and all that kind of stuff, but it's really had a comeback. There's all kinds of breweries and coffee shops and art stores and awesome restaurants and things like that. So it's a pretty cool area to go to. And then after that, I'll be at C2E2, probably with the National Cartoonist Society. And then that's as far as I have plotted out at the moment.
Okay. That first one you said, is it like every February? So somebody catches it later on?
It's usually the same, the second or third week in February. It's a one-day show. It's pretty cool.
So if you're listening in 2020 or sometime in the future, check it out. It's probably in February, and you'll probably be there. You'll probably be there,
always,
right?
Yes, it's always in February. I'm always there. The guy that runs this show, that created it, he and I went to high school together. Yeah. So I will always be a guest at that show.
Unless you're listening to this show in 2265 or something, none of us will be there. So.
Right, none of us.
But
none of us are around anymore.
This podcast will live on, though. Yes.
Forever. Right.
Anyway.
Well, that's immortality, right? That's what we really all.
Yeah, that's why I'm doing these. That's the sole reason. So I'm immortal on a podcast. And how can they get a hold of you? Do you have a website or email, Facebook, that type of stuff?
my website is under construction at the moment. So
Great.
right now, the best thing, the best thing to do is find me on Facebook. I'm at Matthew Hansel. My profile is public. My avatar is the Underdog logo.
Yeah.
So you can check me out there. I post a lot of artwork. Or if you don't want to look at my daily rants, sometimes my Instagram is Matthew Hansel as well, and that's just art. So it's a lot of fun to look at that. I actually prefer Instagram out of the three major media: Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. But that's just me.
Well, you're also an artist, so you have art to show.
Yes, pictures are my thing, right?
Yes. And let's see. Go ahead.
I think that's all the plugging that I have for it at the moment. Did I mention I'm doing 2 Commander McBragg stories?
Yeah.
One of those is going to be, or I think both of them are backups in Underdog 2 and 3.
I don't think you could get away with this, but I'd love it if you would do this. The guy Commander McBragg usually talks to? He says, "Really, I must be going."
Oh yes.
It's always the same voice, but he looks completely different in every show. And I would say it would be funny is every panel it'd just be a different guy just sitting there.
If DreamWorks would let me do that, I would do that because. That was one of the things was when I went to go, I try to be as screen accurate as possible.
Yeah.
And so, I have lots of screen caps of the episodes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that's in my McBragg file, I have a sub-file of just all of the assistants or friends that he's talking to. Yeah. And you're right, because it's the same guy doing I don't know who it is that does the voice, but he's, sometimes he's bald with white hair, other times he has, jet black hair and a mustache.
Yes. I put a few in the example. I said a few of McBragg's disinterested friends, and I just had a page with like 3 or 4 pictures or something on it.
Yes. Well, and a lot of times I always think that he only ever talked to them when they were sitting in front of the globe.
Yes.
But in going through and watching, all the episodes to prep for doing the art, then you quickly find out, no, they were standing. Sometimes he was, they were in a parade one time. It was.
But anyway.
Oh my goodness, he's just such a fantastic character.
Yes, well, my friend Lee Hester, who runs Lee's Comics, who did my first guest on the second episode of this podcast. Yeah, that's his favorite character. He thinks he's the best, and he said, "I just want a compilation of that one." Although they are all available on the Underdog set, so you can get them there. But yeah, he just. But anyway.
Well, McBragg was my first solo penciling gig.
Oh.
Because I had just been inking and coloring for American Mythology, and so I emailed my editor one day and said, here's some Underdog sample pages, and I'd really like a shot at penciling, but I've not done it before, so if there's a short story or something with a long deadline, that would be great. And Mike emails me right back. He goes, "How about Commander McBragg?" I'm like, so he sent me the first script, which was Commander McBragg talking about how he discovered the giants on Easter Island, and his friend Medusa helps him.
Now, helps him out. I do have to ask this: are these stories longer stories, like 5 pages or more?
No, these are 3-pagers.
Oh, okay. Because I was thinking, the whole Commander McBragg thing was always a 90-second bit. So I was wondering if you had longer stories.
Yeah, no, they're 3-page stories with 6 or 7 panels on a page. So there's a lot jammed in there.
Right.
And then I had just turned in the McBragg story, and I was on the phone with Bill Gavin, who said he had just turned down Underdog and Pals 1 because he was on a super tight deadline for Archie. And he goes, "But I recommended you, so maybe they're going to call you." And while I was on the phone with Bill, my editor was emailing or messaging me on Facebook saying, "I need Underdog and Pals 1 done in 2 weeks. Can you do it?"
Oh, wow.
And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Welcome to the big leagues. I'll see you at the end of July."
Wow.
And that was, so it's kind of baptism by fire.
Very good, yeah. Well, I always wish American Mythology luck, and I hope they continue to succeed, whether or not I'm writing for them or not, but it's like, man, they have the most erratic. Yes, we should.
We should work on that, because I would like to do an Underdog special, or I really think they should do another Underdog free comic book day issue, or what's the October event called? Comic
the
book
Halloween one?
Yes, yeah. I think an Underdog with Batty Man or with the Witch.
Yeah.
That would be a fun Halloween thing to do.
And just have the electric eel on the side. No, I don't know. I'm just kidding.
Right. Right, exactly.
Anyway, all right. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you today.
It was great talking to you, too.
We will talk offline about getting some work together done and get some Underdog stories out there. And I want to thank you for being my podcast guest today.
Thanks. Thank you for inviting me. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening, and thank you again, Matt Hansel, for being my special guest. Episode number 35 will be coming soon. This has been the Fun Ideas Podcast. This is Mark Arnold speaking. This episode is copyright 2019 Fun Ideas Productions. Thank you very much, and have a good night.